Right, our next speaker this morning is going to be Ian Little from the Endangered Wildlife Trust, and he's going to be speaking to us a little bit on the kind of the priorities as well, on lost focus, the need to realign conservation priorities in favour of endemics. Sorry, is it on? The aircon. Who's the master of... Is it a bit stuffy in here? Okay. So if it's not too loud outside, maybe we'll just also leave the door open so this side of the room doesn't faint. Okay.
Do I need to press on the laptop?
Thanks, Ian.
Or is there a...
Okay.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, I'm going to be focused more on the conceptual side of prioritizing and trying to change mindsets around what species we focus on in terms of prioritizing for conservation. I'm going to look at whether current species-based conservation priorities are effective, whether efficiently allocating current resources in order for maximal conservation of our threatened taxa is effective, whether we should be focusing on endemic taxa, and whether we have done this sufficiently, and what about species that are not threatened but are endemic. And then I'll use some examples of projects that we are currently busy with at the Endangered Wildlife Trust. Now, I just want to clarify from the very start, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing the conservation of the big and fuzzies that we have been focusing on over the last 50 odd years or so. These species do need the prioritization. All I'm saying is that we need to re-look at the allocation of resources and start looking at the smaller, the small five, as some people like to refer to them. In 2000, Norman Myers and his associates developed the concept of biodiversity hotspots, and this concept has been used in the prioritization of conservation areas over the last decade and more. And these are based on centers of excellence. This concept has been largely accepted by the conservation community as a silver bullet, as Norman puts it. This is a map of the biodiversity hotspots, the initial biodiversity hotspots. There are 25. About 44% of all species of vascular plants and 35% of all species in 4 vertebrate groups are confined to these 25 hotspots, which comprise only 1.4% of the land surface of the Earth. And that's why Norman calls it a silver bullet approach. By conserving a very small proportion of the land surface, we conserve a massive proportion of the species. In South Africa, the first 2 recognized hotspots were the succulent Karoo and the Cape Floristic region. Now, I'll elaborate on these as we go. This is a very complicated table, but there are 2 points that I want you to focus on here. One is at the bottom here. You'll notice that almost 40% of those hotspots were already under formal conservation. The second thing is on the right. The 2 South African hotspots accounted for the lowest proportion of vertebrate diversity out of all of the hotspots in the world. So those were floristic hotspots. They didn't account for hunting. This is just to bring that point home. If we look at the birds, the mammals, the reptiles, and the amphibians, ours were the lowest out of all of them in the world. Then, of course, there was a revision of the hotspots, and in the revision we got assigned a 3rd hotspot, or a portion of it shared with Mozambique, the Maputo-land, Pondoland, Albany hotspot. In terms of the vertebrates, this hotspot covers the amphibians fairly well, but the other 3 groups are still left pretty depauperate in terms of endemic species. And then one other thing that I wanted to bring out from the hotspots concept is one of the major threats to these hotspots, and that's human populations. It would be really nice to see a revised version of this study because it was done in 2000 when the hotspots concept came out. What it found was that 20% of the global population occurred in these hotspots. And if we consider that the hotspots only cover about 12% of the terrestrial surface that is habitable, it's a large proportion of our population. And at that stage, the growth rate in those hotspots was 1.8%, which is considerably more than the 1.3% global average. So what can we see from this? Endemics are useful for prioritizing conservation globally. Endemics can act as umbrella species for conservation. Global hotspots are under major threat from population growth, and South African hotspots are floristically dominant. So we need to reassign our focus towards faunal groups. This is a study by Bon et al. in Ecology Letters. The authors are from University of Sheffield, but they based their research in South Africa largely based on SAVAP data, bird data, because these are pretty extensive. If we look at the number of threatened taxa and the area where the highest species diversity of threatened taxa occur, we find that in the northeastern part of the country is the sort of congregation of threatened bird taxa. This is largely because we are the southern edge of the range of most of these species, with a lot of the Africa's threatened species occurring throughout southern and east Africa. And that begs the question of whether we should expend a lot of conservation energy and resources in the conservation of these species. And I believe that we should. We have an onus on the conservation of all species within South Africa, whether they are centered in other countries or not. And it also proves the incredible value of Kruger National Park and potentially the foresight of the starters of that park. And then if we look at endemic bird species distributions, we find that if we compare those with plant species diversity, there's a very close correlation. So endemic bird species can act as a very nice umbrella for the conservation of other species, and specifically plants in this case. So, as I said, endemic species can potentially be useful for conservation planning, and the conservation of endemic species, especially outside of conservation areas. And I want to really push on this point. A lot of conservation effort and a lot of conservation resources are focused in conservation areas. We need to change that mindset and start working more outside of conservation areas, in what some people refer to as the matrix. And this will contribute significantly to overall biodiversity conservation in South Africa. Just a quick look at the proportion of endemic species in the different groups. About 10% of the mammals are endemic. Birds, much lower, but this is the most speciose group, so keep that in mind. And then reptiles higher and amphibians higher. This table doesn't account for freshwater fish and invertebrates, but both those groups would be very high. Then if we look at the grassland biome, this being the focus of my work, it's a very species-rich biome in terms of plant diversity, over 3,300 plant species. 15 of the 34 endemic mammal species occur in the grasslands, 12 of our 40 endemic bird species, and then of course the 5 Ramsar wetland sites. Now what's scary in the grasslands is over 60% of the grasslands have already been irreversibly transformed. Only about 2.2% of the grasslands are formally conserved. And now the area that we focus on the most is, well, have prioritized the most for conservation attention is the most highland grasslands. And this being one of our major water producing parts of the grassland, only 1.5% of them are formally conserved. And if we look at the endemic bird species, it is the center of their endemism, aside from obviously the Western Cape. But that is recognized in one of the hotspots and is receiving a lot of conservation attention. If we look at our endemic bird species, this is a list of South Africa's endemic bird species, and then highlight the threatened species in amongst them. Some of them are receiving conservation attention, but a large proportion of them haven't received any. The Knysna warbler, Knysna woodpecker, melodious lark, very little conservation attention. The two most threatened are like Boertes and Rudd's lark. BirdLife South Africa are doing work with them, but not directly focused on the species and their conservation. And then yellow-breasted pipit is one that we are now focusing on as a species conservation target. This is the bird, for those of you who don't know it. It's endemic to South Africa along this eastern escarpment. It's globally recognized as vulnerable, but this assessment needs to be reassessed, and I can criticize the person who did it. I did it myself this year for the South African Red List. We have very little data to base this on. So we are initiating a PhD research program, hopefully starting in January once we find a candidate to take it on, to really figure out what's going on with the species, what is their distribution, what's their abundance, and whether it can be used as an indicator species for grassland management. As I said, it's endemic, it's very sensitive to disturbance. A little bit overgrazed and too frequently burnt, and this bird disappears. So it's a real good potential as an indicator species for grassland management. Just a quick look at climate prediction model that BirdLife and IUCN put together. That's the current distribution, and it's predicted that by 2085, those two little green dots, that's what their distribution will be. So massive range contraction. Luckily for the bird, that is centered on the Ukashamba Drakensberg, which is a conserved area, as we know. Now if we look at the mammals, there's an extensive list of threatened mammals in South Africa. To start off with, we can take out the marine mammals to focus on the terrestrial species, and then take out the big and fuzzies. They already receive conservation attention. Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't conserve them. And then restrict it to the endemic species. Now, what you see left as the threatened endemic mammal species in South Africa is moles, shrews, mice, and bats. Rodents. Whether they fly, whether they burrow, or whether they are terrestrial, they're all rodents. And this is where the mammal conservation focus needs to switch to. We are just starting to work with golden moles. It's a new project. It'll be centered in southern Mpumalanga, essentially focusing on what have we got in the country, because at the moment we have a number of species that are recognized, but they're cryptic species, and this work will very potentially uncover a number of new species in the country. One of the species we're focusing on, Amblysomus robustus, is vulnerable. As we go through, I'll illustrate the conservation status of others. The ones we're focusing on are grassland specialists. They're endemic. They're also very sensitive to disturbance. They're very shallow burrowing species or group. They're cryptic. They're very difficult to identify, but through genetic means it becomes a lot easier. 21 species of golden moles occur in sub-Saharan Africa, 18 of which are centered in southern Africa. 2 are critically endangered, 5 are endangered, 4 are vulnerable, and 3 are near threatened. Another interesting point is that of the 10 most threatened mammals in South Africa, 5 of them are golden moles. So this is really pushing the little 5 concept of conservation. And then obviously, once we've got a better understanding of the distribution and the conservation status of species like these, we've got far more firepower to work with EIAs and preventing mining and so on and so forth. Then to have a quick look at some of the other groups, which I'm not going to focus on here. The amphibians, as I said, are very well covered in the MPAH, and we at the EWT have started a new conservation program focusing on amphibians. Jean Tarrant, who, I don't know if she's in the room here. There she is. Jean will be heading up that program, so we're going to try and get a grasp of threatened and endemic amphibians. If we look at the invertebrates, there's not a lot of work being done on them. There are some conservation organizations like the Brenton Blue Trust and others that are starting to get a handle on them, and it's another group that has incredibly high endemism in South Africa. And then the reptiles. Leon Muller touched on this yesterday quite nicely. We have a lot of endemic reptiles that need conservation attention. Us at the EWT, we've started with this one, which is the obvious one from a grassland perspective, the giant girdle lizard, or better known as the sun gazer. They occur in the northeastern Free State and southern Mpumalanga, that's their global range. Currently considered vulnerable, they're grassland specialists, they're endemic, they're also very sensitive to habitat destruction, much like the golden moles. Next bit. Much like the golden moles, they're very shallow, they dig very shallow burrows, so any form of ploughing has a highly detrimental impact on these guys. And if you look at aerial photographs of their global range, at least 90% of that area has been ploughed for crop agriculture of some sorts. They're also under extensive threat from trade. Leon again alluded to this, they're worth a lot of money in the illegal pet trade, and one of the intricacies with these guys is that they don't breed in captivity. Well, they haven't been shown to yet. And a lot of the traders use captive breeding as an excuse for selling, but they've never been shown to breed, so that's impossible. They've been taken out of the wild. Some take-home messages. Conservationists and researchers have a lot more work to do, especially with the small five, the small rodents in the case of mammals, reptiles, invertebrates and so on. This is not a bad thing, it's an exciting opportunity, and I really want to implore upon conservationists and researchers to take this on. Conservation work needs to focus more on smaller, less charismatic species, and the reason I put this point in was purely for the word charismatic. We need to move away from charisma. It's more difficult to get funding, but the work is necessary. Conservation work and resources need to be focused outside of existing reserves. As I said, plowing more resources into existing conservation areas is not going to conserve the matrix and all the species that are outside of those existing reserves. And finally, non-threatened endemics also deserve conservation. This is a bit contentious, but they can act as indicators, flagships, and umbrella species for biodiversity ecosystem processes and resultant ecosystem services. I've just put up 3 basic examples here: buff streaked chat, grey-winged francolin, and ground woodpecker. These species are not recognized as threatened at this stage, but they only occur in South Africa, and without conservation attention they soon will be threatened. So why not start looking at them? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. Do we have any questions for Ian? Clear as mud. No questions. Sue.
There's been